Should fighters eat carbs in camp? The short answer is yes, fighters should eat carbs in camp. If you're trying to have a fight camp without carbohydrates, it's kind of like trying to drive across the country while your gas tank's on empty. It doesn't make any sense, but there are still a majority of athletes and coaches out there that severely cut their carbs when they're in fight camp. This is really dangerous. It can lead to injury, it can lead to burnout, mental fatigue, and it can probably ruin your chances of winning your next fight. So in today's video, I'm gonna be breaking down everything that you need to know about eating carbs in fight camp. It's most likely gonna take your game to the next level, so stick around. What's going on? Coach Adam here, back with another Fight Science Made Simple video. On this channel, we break down everything you need to know about strength, conditioning, nutrition to be the best combat athlete on and off the mat. If you're new to the channel, make sure you subscribe, hit the notification bell so you don't miss out on any of the fight science knowledge that we're dropping. And if you're digging the video, if you're getting a lot out of it, you're just feeling generous today, hit the like button, show some love, show some support. It helps us out a lot. So carbohydrates in camp. You would be shocked if I told you the number of fighters that I've talked with that cut out all of their carb intake when they're getting ready for a fight camp. It's a really common strategy that we see a lot of athletes and coaches undergo when it comes time to start peaking for their fight. It's a really old school strategy, cutting carbs in camp, but it's outdated and it can actually do more harm than good. So today we're gonna be breaking down a couple things. We're gonna be talking about why it's important to be eating carbs in camp. We're gonna be talking about why coaches and athletes cut out their carbs throughout the camp. And I'm gonna give you a couple strategies to help you better fuel your body with carbohydrates in camp while also making weight. So first and foremost, why are carbs so important for our performance? Carbohydrates are our body's preferred energy source when we're doing any kind of high intensity exercise or training. Basically, if your heart rate is above 130 beats per minute, you're most likely primarily using carbohydrates to fuel this kind of performance, this kind of activity. The reason our body prefers carbs is because carbs are easier to break down than fat. Fat takes a long time to break down. It needs a lot of oxygen to break down and supply energy for performance. And if our heart rate is extended 130 beats per minute or more, it's gonna be really difficult for our body to primarily use fat to fuel your performance. Carbs also play a big role in recovery and just your overall mental alertness and your ability to concentrate as well. So how does this relate to combat sports? Well, if you look at any combat sport, from MMA to boxing, Muay Thai to Jiu-Jitsu, your heart rate is definitely going to be above 130 beats per minute for the duration of the competition. And the time of competition is pretty long. It can be anywhere from 3 2-minute rounds if we're looking at like amateur kickboxing, 5 5-minute rounds for championship MMA, all the way up to 10-minute rounds or no time limit competitions and rounds when it comes to jiu-jitsu super fights. So this longer duration of high intensity exercise requires a large amount of carbohydrates to fuel the performance, to reach peak performance, but to also avoid injury and burnout. So if we understand why carbs are so important for combat sport performance, then why is it that so many coaches and so many fighters cut carbs when it comes down to fight camp? Well, the answer is pretty simple. First, they just don't understand the science behind nutrition for sport, so they don't realize how important carbs are for fueling our body. And the second reason they cut out carbs is to make weight for their competition. See, when we eat carbohydrates, those carbs get broken down into what's called glucose. This is basically just sugar in our blood. This sugar in our blood is then used for exercise, fighting, lifting, all of our performance. Any of that glucose, that sugar in our blood that isn't used for exercise, it's going to get stored in our muscle or in our liver as something called glycogen. This glycogen is created by combining that glucose, that sugar in your blood, with water, and then that gets stored inside of your muscle. So when we eat an abundance of carbs, and those carbs eventually get stored in our muscle or in our liver as glycogen, this also is going to cause water to be retained in your body. So when we severely cut out carbs from our diet, there isn't enough glucose in our bloodstream to be stored as glycogen, so we're depleting that glycogen from our muscle. And in return, we're also going to remove water from our muscle. This is why when you see like fad diets, or people are like, I lost 20 pounds in 1 week by cutting carbs, they just dehydrated themselves. They cut out carbs, so there was no glycogen in their muscle, which means there was severely less water in their muscle, and so they lost weight. Now, cutting carbs can be a good strategy for losing water weight in fight week, but is not something that we should do throughout fight camp. And the reason for this is because the risk isn't worth the reward. Most fighters panic when it comes to making weight. They stress about it. They don't have any real strategy that's backed in science. So they do a ton of cardio and they cut out their carbs, trying to make weight as quickly as possible. But what they don't realize is that they're setting themselves up for just a worse performance. Like I told you earlier, they're setting themselves up for injury. They're not going to be able to focus as much, and they're just breaking down their bodies. So we understand why carbohydrates are important for our fight performance in camp. We also understand why coaches and athletes resort to cutting out carbohydrates in camp to make weight. So now I want to break down a couple strategies that you can implement immediately into your fight camp so you can make weight really efficiently and safely without the removal of carbohydrates throughout your training, because like we talked about, we need those carbs to reach peak performance and to dominate when we step into the ring. So strategy number one is you want to have a solid plan when it comes to actually cutting weight. When we do things randomly, we have random results. So anytime that I coach our athletes through a weight cut, we want to make sure that we go into fight camp, so 8 weeks out from a fight, at the most 16% away from their fight weight. So for example, if I have an athlete that's going to fight at 165 pounds, the absolute most that I would want them to weigh going into fight camp would be like 191 pounds. From there, once we have our weight that we're entering fight camp at, we can then decide what we want to weigh going into fight week. So for our athletes, we want to make sure that they never weigh more than 10% of their fight weight going into fight week. So if I have that same athlete that's fighting at 165 pounds, the Monday of fight week, the absolute most that they could weigh would be 181.5 pounds. Now, every fighter is a little bit different, and these are the top end ranges. I typically like the numbers for our fighters to be a little bit lower. I like to do as little of a weight cut as possible when we're in camp, but this all depends on, how easy it is for you to sweat and lose water, what your body fat percentage is, what your lean mass is, what weight you're fighting at, how active you are throughout your week. There are a lot of factors that go into it, but the most important thing is that you have a weight cut strategy outside of camp and going into camp, and you're not just trying to string together a last minute cut. This is going to allow you to eat carbs throughout camp to fuel your performance in training and peak for your fight without hurting or damaging your body. So the second strategy that you can implement into your fight camp when it comes to eating carbs is the timing of our carbs. Naturally, there's going to be some kind of weight cutting, weight descent throughout camp. So we can't just eat carbs, as many carbs as we want, whenever we want throughout the day. We want to make sure that we're strategically eating carbs around our training session. So one strategy that I like to use with our athletes is called the 4-2-1 method. So 4 hours before we train, I like to have our athletes eat a full meal. This is a lean protein, a complex carbohydrate like maybe a brown rice or an oat or a whole grain bread or some potatoes, something like that, and then some vegetables as well. This is going to give us a good meal, and it's going to start loading carbs in our body that can break down a little bit slower. So in that 4-hour time when it comes to train, we're going to have some energy. Then the 2 part of that rule, 2 hours before we train, we want to have a snack of a little bit of protein and a simpler carbohydrate. So this could be something like a protein shake and a banana, or like some fruit and some yogurt. A combination of protein and carbohydrates that, we have enough time to start breaking it down to use for our training and for our performance, but it's not so much food or so complex that, in that 2-hour time, if we eat a full meal, it might not all be digested, and that could hurt our performance. And then in the 1 hour before we train, we want to have a simple carbohydrate. Think liquids. This could be something like applesauce or a sports drink, or they make carb powder, something like a dextrose powder. This is a quick, fast-acting liquid carbohydrate. Most of the digestion is going to occur in your mouth, so you're going to have that sugar in your bloodstream immediately for training. Now, after you train, you probably want to get 30 to 60 grams of carbs in just to replenish what was lost from your training. But then throughout the day, far away from our training sessions, in the morning or in the evening or whenever we're not training, we want to try to avoid carbs as much as possible. This way we can get the benefits for our weight cutting process, but at the same time, we're still eating carbs around training so we can fuel our performance. And the third strategy I have for you when it comes to eating carbs in fight camp is doing the majority of your weight cut the week of your fight. If you plan your weight cut in a smart way, if you do most of your dieting in the off camp when you don't have a fight book, if we're around that 16 to 10% number throughout camp, and when we go into fight week at 10% of our fight weight, this is going to make the weight cutting process so much simpler. In fight camp, you shouldn't be training at all. All of your hard work is done. If you're not in shape in fight week, you're not going to magically get into shape. If we're trying to train or spar or do cardio in fight week, we're just breaking our body down. So because we're not training in fight week, we don't really need carbohydrates because there's no performance to fuel. So when it comes to fight week, my number one focus for our athletes is making weight. And so this is where we cut carbs. Because our fighters are not training, they're not sparring, they're not lifting, they're not doing any cardio, I'm comfortable with removing carbs from their diet. This way we can start to deplenish the water from their muscle. We can start letting their weight come off. We can prepare them for the dehydration process. And there's no training that we have to fuel or supply. Once they make weight, they step off the scale. We have a really smart, science-backed rehydration, refueling protocol to put those carbs and put that water back in their body. But we don't do a majority of our carb cutting or even a majority of our weight cutting until fight week. So there you have it, some really useful strategies that you can start implementing immediately when it comes to your fight camp. This is gonna help you make weight easier. This is gonna help you have incredible performance. And I guarantee you're gonna feel like a completely different athlete next time you step in the mat, in the cage, in the ring for competition if you implement these strategies. If you want to learn more about weight cutting, we made another video of some of the biggest weight cutting mistakes I see fighters make. You can click right up here to watch that video. And in the comments down below, let me know what's your favorite pre-training carbohydrate. Let me know in the comments. I'll see you next time.